Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of those stories that feels heavy even before you lie down. If you're enjoying these late-night history journeys, gently tap like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely adds something to your evenings. And tell me in the comments which country you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's comforting to picture this story unfolding across so many quiet rooms at once. You're standing in the present, but the air around you starts to thicken with echoes from the past, with rules whispered and then ignored, promises made and then casually stepped over. This is the kind of history where you probably won't survive this style, at least not emotionally. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You walk slowly backward through time, and you notice something surprising right away. Even ancient warriors talk about limits. You hear murmurs about sacred days when fighting should stop, about temples that shouldn't be touched, about messengers who must be spared. One mainstream historical fact slips into focus. The earliest known written laws of war appear in ancient Mesopotamia, where kings boast not only of victories, but of restraint, at least on stone tablets meant to impress the gods. You can almost smile at the irony. These rules sound noble, but they're fragile, like chalk lines drawn on a battlefield that rain will wash away. As you keep walking, you realize these early limits exist less to protect the weak and more to protect the idea of order. You stand beside soldiers who believe the gods are watching, tallying not just victories but manners. There's even a quirky historical tidbit murmured among them. Some ancient armies believe breaking certain rules of war will curse their own crops back home. So restraint is sometimes less about mercy and more about fear of bad harvests. Historians still argue whether these beliefs genuinely reduced violence, or simply shifted it elsewhere, out of sight and off the record. You drift forward again, and the tone changes. You hear laughter, sharper now, as victory becomes total. This is where the rules start to crack. You notice how easily enemy becomes not quite human. You watch commanders explain that what's about to happen is regrettable but necessary, a phrase that will echo for centuries. You're not seeing explicit horror yet, just the moment before it, when moral breaks fail quietly. It's unsettling because it feels familiar, like modern excuses wearing ancient armor. You pause beside a battlefield where survivors gather, hoping for mercy promised by custom. Sometimes they receive it, and sometimes they don't. One mainstream fact anchors you here. Even in ancient Greece, where philosophers debate ethics, entire cities can be legally destroyed if they resist conquest. The idea is called exemplary punishment, and it's meant to discourage others. You feel the chill of that logic because it's efficient, tidy, and terrifyingly reusable. A light, almost sleepy sarcasm creeps in as you think, yes, nothing says civilized society like wiping out your neighbor to make a point. You continue drifting, and you notice how stories of restraint survive mostly in the telling. Victors commission poets and scribes who emphasize mercy, not the mess. A fringe tidbit floats up here. Some ancient war chronicles exaggerate kindness because rulers believe future enemies will surrender faster if they expect mercy, even if that mercy rarely arrives. Historians still argue whether these narratives reflect reality or function as early psychological warfare, shaping expectations rather than reporting facts. The rules, you realize, are often written by those least likely to suffer when they're broken. You walk past camps where soldiers justify actions with a shrug and a joke, the same way people do now when bending office rules or traffic laws. The scale is different, but the mindset feels uncomfortably close. You hear a modern aside in your own head. This is where humanity really commits to the idea that rules are optional if the stakes feel high enough. As you move on, night settles over the landscape. Fires crackle. You sit near one, listening to veterans talk about honor while sharpening blades. You catch another mainstream fact slipping through the smoke. The concept of no quarter, meaning no prisoners taken, is widely accepted for much of history, and only slowly becomes controversial. It's strange how something so final can feel, to them, like a practical decision rather than a moral one. You let your breathing slow, because the tone here is meant to lull, not shock. Even so, you can't ignore the pattern forming. Rules are born from fear of chaos, but chaos always seems to win when power feels threatened. A quirky detail surfaces again. Some medieval codes of war include penalties for harming livestock, but say little about civilians, revealing priorities that feel oddly practical and deeply unsettling at the same time. Historians still argue whether these codes represent genuine ethical progress or simply economic self-interest dressed up as morality. You stand at the edge of this section's journey, watching the first big fracture line appear in the idea of just war. You realise you're not here to catalogue every horror yet. You're here to feel the moment when humanity decides that rules are suggestions and enemies are problems to be solved. It's a quiet decision, often made around a campfire, long before the shouting starts. The firelight flickers softer now, and you feel the story preparing to move forward, toward places where these broken rules become routine rather than exception. You take one last look at the chalk lines on the ground, already smudged by footsteps, already fading. This is where it all begins. Not with monsters, but with ordinary people convincing themselves that tonight, just this once, the rules don't apply. You keep moving without a break, the ground under your feet changing from carefully drawn lines to scorched earth. The idea of restraint you just left behind doesn't vanish all at once. It thins, stretches, and then snaps. You find yourself standing in the ancient world, where war isn't an interruption of life but part of its rhythm, like seasons or drought. Cities rise knowing they may someday be erased, and people grow up understanding that walls are promises, not guarantees. You walk past an ancient city at dawn, its gates closed, defenders exhausted. This is where ancient slaughters begin, not always with rage but with calculation. One mainstream historical fact settles in quietly. In many early civilizations, including Assyria, total destruction of a resisting city is considered lawful and even virtuous. You hear scribes carve victories into stone, boasting of erased towns the way someone today might list achievements on a resume. The chilling part is how normal it feels to everyone around you. You notice civilians gathering near temples, believing sacred spaces might protect them. Sometimes they're right, often they're not. The belief itself becomes a trap, concentrating fear into one place. A quirky historical tidbit drifts by here. Some ancient armies deliberately spare temples not out of mercy, but because looting them is believed to anger local gods who might then follow the army home. Historians still argue whether these selective protections saved lives or simply redirected violence into streets and homes nearby. As you move deeper, you feel how conquest turns personal. Soldiers are promised land, status, captives, rewards that blur survival with entitlement. You watch the language shift. Enemy becomes spoils. It's unsettling how quickly words do the heavy lifting, making actions feel inevitable. You catch yourself thinking, with a touch of sleepy sarcasm, that branding really has always been humanity's strongest skill. You drift into the aftermath of a siege, where silence replaces shouting. Survivors are sorted, not by innocence, but by usefulness. One mainstream fact anchors the moment. Enslavement of conquered populations is standard practice across ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern cultures. It's not hidden, it's regulated, taxed, and normalized. Children are counted, craftsmen noted, elders dismissed. You feel the weight of how systems make cruelty efficient without anyone needing to shout orders. You pause beside a historian's dilemma, hovering just out of sight. Sources exaggerate numbers, inflate brutality, or downplay it depending on who's writing. A fringe tidbit surfaces here. Some ancient text intentionally overstate massacres to intimidate future enemies, turning terror into a strategic message. Historians still argue whether reported slaughters reflect reality or function as psychological warfare, and that uncertainty itself feels eerie, like not knowing how dark a room truly is. You continue walking, and the scale grows. Entire regions empty as people flee before armies arrive. You realise something important. Even when mass killing happens, it's often framed as prevention. Destroy one city thoroughly, and others might surrender without a fight. It's a logic that feels coldly modern. You hear a quiet modern aside in your head. This is the ancestor of deterrence theory, just without the spreadsheets. As night falls again, you sit near another fire, this one surrounded by veterans who've done this before. They tell stories, not of victims, but of endurance and clever tactics. There's laughter, weary and proud. One mainstream fact slips in gently. Ancient military training often includes psychological conditioning, meant to harden soldiers against pity. You realize this isn't about monsters. It's about ordinary people trained to turn empathy off like a switch. A strange, almost absurd detail surfaces as you listen. Some ancient armies carry talismans believed to protect them from the spirits of those they kill, small charms rattling against armor. It's a quirky tidbit, but it says a lot. On some level, even they know something is watching. Historians still argue whether such practices reflect guilt, superstition, or simply cultural habit. But standing here, they feel like quiet confessions. You move on again, drifting toward cultures that prize honor and poetry. You expect softness. Instead, you find ritualized destruction. Cities are destroyed ceremonially, as if violence itself needs a script. You notice how songs and epics later turn these moments into heroic tales, smoothing edges, trimming screams. This is where memory begins its work, sanding history down into something easier to hold at bedtime. You feel the cumulative weight now. Ancient slaughters aren't chaotic outbursts. They're structured, expected, even planned. The shock comes not from their savagery, but from their normalcy. You think back to those early rules you just left behind, and realize they didn't fail accidentally. They were never meant to protect everyone. They were meant to protect the powerful from disorder, and once order is restored through fear, no one asks too many questions. As you reach the edge of this section's path, the world starts to transition. These early terrors don't disappear with time. They become templates. You sense that what you've seen here will echo forward, refined and scaled up. The fires burn lower, the voices soften, and the ancient world recedes behind you, leaving behind a lesson that's hard to unlearn. When violence is rewarded, it doesn't need hatred to thrive. It only needs permission. You don't stop walking as the ancient world fades. It reshapes itself around you. Stone turns into cathedral walls, banners snap in colder air, and belief steps forward as the loudest voice in the crowd. The violence you've already felt doesn't disappear here. It gains a reason, a story people can tell themselves while sharpening swords. You're moving into an age where faith and war wrap tightly around each other, and once they do, it becomes very hard to tell where devotion ends and brutality begins. You stand among a gathering of armed pilgrims, ordinary people convinced they're doing something extraordinary. One mainstream historical fact settles in gently but firmly. During the medieval Crusades, church authorities promised spiritual rewards, including remission of sins, to those who fight. You feel the power of that idea immediately. Violence no longer needs to be justified by strategy alone. It's framed as obedience. You notice how shoulders straighten when people believe heaven is taking notes. As the march begins, you hear songs instead of commands. There's excitement here, not dread. You catch a soft, sleepy irony in yourself. Nothing quite fuels mass violence like the certainty you're the good guy. You remember those chalk lines of rules from earlier, already smudged, and realize faith doesn't erase them. It simply redraws them tighter around us, leaving everyone else outside. You arrive at a captured city and the air changes. Defenders surrender, expecting mercy promised by shared humanity. Instead, the crowd surges. One widely accepted fact anchors this moment. When Jerusalem falls in 1099, contemporary accounts describe widespread killing of the city's inhabitants. Even chroniclers on the winning side don't deny it. They frame it as purification. You feel how language transforms horror into ritual, turning slaughter into something almost ceremonial. A quirky historical tidbit floats up here, strange and unsettling. Some crusaders believe bathing weapons in enemy blood makes them spiritually potent, a belief blending folk superstition with religious zeal. Historians still argue whether such practices are literal or symbolic exaggerations by later writers, but standing here, the belief itself matters more than its accuracy. It tells you how thoroughly violence and faith have fused. You keep moving, because this isn't just one place or one army. Across regions, the same logic repeats. Cities are divided into believers and non-believers, allies and obstacles. You notice something subtle. Acts that would be condemned among fellow believers are excused, even celebrated, when done to outsiders. It's not chaos, it's selective morality, and it's terrifyingly efficient. You drift into quieter moments between battles, where leaders justify actions to their followers. They speak of necessity, of divine will, of history watching. You catch a modern aside in your thoughts. This sounds suspiciously like press conferences centuries early. The tone is different, the costume stranger, but the structure feels familiar. As time passes, you realize the Crusades aren't an exception, they're a template. Similar logic appears wherever faith and power intertwine. One mainstream fact grounds you again. Religiously framed wars occur across cultures, not just in medieval Europe, from conflicts in the Islamic world to sectarian violence elsewhere. The details change, but the pattern remains. When violence is declared sacred, restraint becomes optional. You notice how civilians suffer most quietly here. They don't write chronicles or wear armour. They're simply caught between declarations made far above them. You think back to ancient temples once spared out of fear of angry gods. Now, sacred spaces themselves become targets or trophies. The shift feels important. Violence isn't just permitted, it's sanctified. Another odd detail surfaces as you listen to stories traded around campfires. Some warriors carry relics, bones, scraps of cloth, believed to guarantee victory. It's a small, almost tender human habit, clinging to lucky charms in terrifying circumstances. Historians still argue whether these relics provided real morale boosts or simply gave chaos a comforting shape. But either way, they travel alongside swords, not instead of them. You keep drifting forward, and the language of holy war starts to fray. Over time, even believers grow uneasy. Excess becomes harder to ignore. You hear early critics murmuring about excesses committed in God's name. This is where discomfort begins, not among victims, but among insiders who realize something has gone wrong. It's slow, cautious, and often drowned out. But it's there. You pause in a later century, watching rulers invoke faith more strategically than passionately. The fervour cools, but the damage remains. You realize that once violence has worn a halo, it's hard to scrape it off completely. The memory lingers, ready to be reused whenever convenient. You think back to that idea of exemplary punishment from earlier, and see how faith adds emotional fuel to an already dangerous logic. There's a strange calm settling in you now, the kind that comes from recognizing patterns, ancient slaughters, sacred justifications, selective mercy. They're all variations on the same theme. The Crusades didn't invent war crimes. They wrapped them in hymns, and that wrapping made them easier to carry, easier to repeat. As you reach the end of this stretch, the banners begin to change again. Faith doesn't disappear, but it steps back slightly, making room for crowns, flags, and empires. You sense that what's coming next will look more secular, more organized, and perhaps more polite on the surface. But the lessons from this age linger, like incense clinging to fabric long after the ceremony ends. You take one last look at the crossroads where belief and violence shook hands. The echoes follow you as you move on, reminding you that when people are convinced history, or heaven, is on their side, the rules don't just fade. They kneel. You move forward without stopping, and the banners you pass now belong to crowns rather than crosses. Faith still hums in the background, but power has learned to speak for itself. You're walking into the age of empires, where conquest becomes less about divine revelation and more about permanence. This is where war crimes don't just happen in bursts. They settle in, unpack, and start calling themselves administration. You stand at the edge of a newly conquered province, watching officials arrive behind the soldiers. One mainstream historical fact comes into focus. Expanding empires, from Rome to later early modern powers, often rely on systematic punishment of civilian populations to maintain control. Violence isn't just for winning wars anymore, it's for keeping the peace, a phrase that lands with a dull, unsettling irony. You hear it said calmly, as if peace and terror are simply two sides of the same coin. You notice how occupation feels different from battle. There's less shouting, more routine. Soldiers patrol streets that aren't theirs, enforcing laws written far away. Civilians learn new rules quickly or suffer for it. You realise this is where fear becomes ambient, like background noise people eventually stop commenting on. A soft, sleepy aside drifts through your mind. This is bureaucracy's villain arc, and it's just getting started. You watch an example being made. A village accused of resistance is punished publicly, not necessarily because it's the worst offender, but because it's convenient. One mainstream fact anchors the moment. Roman authorities famously used crucifixion and mass reprisals as deterrents against rebellion. The goal isn't secrecy, it's visibility. You feel how spectacle replaces chaos, turning suffering into a message meant to travel farther than any messenger. A quirky historical tidbit slips in here, almost absurd in its detail. Some Roman soldiers carry small notebooks listing fines and punishments, treating discipline like accounting. It's strange, almost comical, until you realise what's being tallied. Historians still argue whether such meticulous record-keeping reduced arbitrary violence or simply made cruelty more consistent. And standing here, consistency doesn't feel like much of a comfort. You keep walking through occupied streets where daily life continues under watchful eyes. Markets reopen. Children play cautiously. This is what makes imperial violence feel so unsettling. It coexists with normalcy. You notice how quickly people adapt, lowering voices, avoiding certain topics. You think back to earlier slaughters and realise something has shifted. Total destruction is less common now, not because of mercy, but because the empire wants taxes. As centuries pass in a blink, empires change names and languages, but patterns repeat. One mainstream fact follows you forward. Early modern empires often use forced relocations and collective punishment to secure borders. Entire communities are moved like chess pieces. You watch families pack what they can carry, not knowing if they'll ever return. It's quieter than a massacre, but it stretches suffering over years instead of days. Another odd detail surfaces as you listen to soldiers complain around a fire. Some empires rotate troops frequently, not for efficiency, but to prevent them from forming sympathies with locals. It's a small administrative choice with enormous moral weight. Historians still argue whether such policies reduced corruption or simply ensured emotional distance, but you can feel the outcome. Violence becomes easier when everyone is temporary. You drift into the perspective of imperial officials, educated, polished, convinced of their civilizing mission. They talk about roads, laws, order. You notice how rarely they mention the cost. A modern aside creeps in. This sounds like a glossy brochure for something deeply unpleasant. The language of improvement smooths over broken homes and empty fields. You pause beside a scholar in this era, quietly uneasy. Philosophers begin questioning whether empire itself creates endless injustice. Their doubts rarely stop policy, but they leave a paper trail of discomfort. One mainstream fact grounds you here. Debates about just governance and imperial cruelty appear in Roman and later imperial writings, showing awareness, if not restraint. Awareness, you realise, doesn't automatically lead to change. You let the firelight flicker again, softer now. You notice how empire turns extraordinary violence into ordinary background. It's no longer shocking when someone disappears. It's just assumed they crossed a line. You remember the holy certainty from earlier, and see how it's been replaced by administrative confidence. Different justification, same outcome. As you move toward the edge of this section, you feel the scale widening. Empires stretch farther than ever, and distance starts to matter. Rulers govern lands they'll never see, relying on reports and numbers. You sense what's coming next. When power moves far away from consequences, cruelty finds room to experiment. You take one last look at occupied streets glowing under lamplight. Life goes on, but it does so carefully, cautiously, always listening. The lesson settles into you gently and heavily at the same time. When violence becomes policy rather than passion, it doesn't burn out. It settles in, furnishing the place, and waits. You don't pause as empires stretch outward. Instead, the ground beneath you seems to tilt, carrying you across oceans. The violence you've been feeling doesn't lessen with distance. It loosens. Far from capitals and courts, consequences thin out, and what remains is experimentation. You're stepping into the colonial world now, where cruelty often hides behind palm trees, trade ledgers, and polite letters sent home. You arrive in a place newly labelled on a map, its name written in an unfamiliar language. One mainstream historical fact settles in as calmly as an official stamp. European colonial powers frequently use extreme violence to extract resources and suppress resistance in overseas territories. What strikes you first isn't the chaos, but the confidence. Orders arrive with seals and signatures, and people obey them because they're written down. You watch local populations assessed like inventories, labour potential, crops, strategic value. You notice how quickly human beings turn into categories. A sleepy, modern aside floats through your head. Spreadsheets really are just weapons that learn to look boring. The people making decisions are thousands of miles away, sipping something warm, trusting reports written by men who know what their bosses want to hear. You stand beside a forced labour site, quiet except for instructions barked in a foreign tongue. This is where colonial violence becomes routine rather than spectacular. One widely accepted fact anchors you here. Systems of forced labour and punishment are central to many colonial economies, from plantations to mining operations. Death isn't always the goal, but it's accepted as a cost. You feel how indifference can be as lethal as rage. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces, unsettling in its banality. Some colonial administrators keep detailed handbooks outlining acceptable punishments for workers, complete with diagrams. Historians still argue whether these manuals were meant to limit abuse or merely standardize it. But standing here, the difference feels academic. Pain organized is still pain. You move through a settlement where missionaries preach compassion while soldiers patrol nearby. The contradiction hangs heavy in the air. You remember the holy justifications from earlier centuries and realize they haven't vanished. They've just softened their tone. Violence is framed as discipline, improvement, or preparation for a better future. You think, with a faint edge of sarcasm, that for your own good might be history's most dangerous phrase. As you drift forward in time, the scale becomes harder to ignore. Entire regions are reshaped to serve distant markets. One mainstream fact follows you like a shadow. Demographic collapse in colonized regions often results from a combination of violence, forced labor, and introduced diseases. No single act explains it all, which makes accountability slippery. You feel how complexity can become a shield. You listen to colonists talk among themselves. They complain about conditions, about home, about locals who don't understand progress. The language is casual, almost bored. Another odd detail surfaces here. Some colonial officers rotate assignments not just for efficiency, but to avoid forming attachments that might soften enforcement. Historians still argue whether this practice was intentional policy or practical necessity, but its effect is clear. Distance breeds ease. You pause at a courtroom far from the capital, where justice wears a different face. Crimes committed by colonizers are judged lightly, if at all. One mainstream fact grounds you again. Legal systems in many colonies explicitly privilege settlers over indigenous populations. Law becomes another tool, not for fairness, but for control. You notice how violence doesn't always need weapons when paperwork will do. You keep walking, and stories begin to surface. Whispered, half-recorded, often denied. Villages punished for failing quotas. Leaders executed as warnings. Families displaced for plantations. These aren't always labelled crimes at the time. They're called policy failures, security measures, unfortunate necessities. You remember how earlier empires justified exemplary punishment and see the same logic wearing tropical uniforms. A fringe tidbit drifts in, strangely human. Some colonizers keep personal diaries filled with doubt, guilt, or exhaustion, never meant for publication. Historians still argue how representative these private misgivings are, but they matter. They show that awareness exists, flickering quietly, even as systems grind on unchanged. You notice how distance dulls outrage back home. Reports are delayed, sanitized, or buried. When scandals do surface, they're framed as exceptions, not features. You catch a modern echo here. How often institutions promise reform without dismantling the structure that caused harm. It's familiar enough to feel almost comforting, which makes it worse. As night settles again, you stand near a river reflecting moonlight, watching boats loaded with goods head toward the sea. You realize this is the heart of colonial violence. Suffering converted into profit, then into normalcy. People back home enjoy sugar, rubber, spices, metals, rarely thinking about the cost. You think back to ancient spoils of war and see how they've been scaled up, abstracted, made polite. You move toward the end of this stretch, and something shifts. Criticism grows louder. Reformers, journalists, and activists begin naming what's happening. One mainstream fact anchors this turn. Exposure of colonial atrocities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries sparks international outrage and early human rights campaigns. It's a crack in the system, not a collapse, but it matters. You pause there, at the moment where denial becomes harder to maintain. Colonial violence doesn't end here, but it's forced into the light. You feel the story preparing to change again, to move into an age where scale, speed, and technology will amplify everything you've seen so far. You take one last look at the distant shoreline, ships disappearing into darkness. The lesson settles gently but firmly. When violence happens far away, it's easier to justify, easier to ignore, and easier to repeat. And history, you're learning, is very good at repeating whatever we allow to stay out of sight. You don't notice the transition at first. The ships fade, the shoreline dissolves, and suddenly the air smells different. Oil, smoke, hot metal. Violence hasn't travelled far this time. It's accelerated. You're stepping into an age where war learns to move faster than empathy can keep up. This is where industry meets conflict, and suffering becomes something that can be scheduled, supplied, and scaled. You stand inside a factory that doesn't make cloth or tools, but weapons. One mainstream historical fact settles in with a mechanical hum. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, industrialization allows nations to equip mass armies and wage total war. You feel how the language changes here. Civilians aren't just bystanders anymore, they're producers, targets, and statistics. The boundary you once sensed between battlefield and home starts to blur. You walk through a city far from the front lines, yet it's no longer safe. Food is rationed, factories run day and night. One sleepy, modern aside floats through your head. This is when war really clocks in for a full-time job. You notice how posters and speeches frame sacrifice as patriotic duty, smoothing over the reality that entire populations are being enlisted without uniforms. As the first truly industrial wars unfold, you see the shock ripple outward. One widely accepted fact anchors you here. World War I introduces weapons and tactics, like poison gas and mass artillery barrages, that kill on an unprecedented scale. You don't linger on the details, you don't need to. What matters is how quickly horror becomes routine. Once something works, it gets used again. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces, oddly bureaucratic. Early gas attacks come with instruction manuals explaining wind direction and dosage. Historians still argue whether commanders fully understood the long-term effects of these weapons, but standing here, the intent feels secondary to the process. Harm has become procedural. You move along railways carrying troops and supplies, noticing how efficiently suffering travels now. Timetables replace improvisation. You remember earlier empires punishing villages as examples, and realize this is that same logic, but mechanized. You catch yourself thinking, with gentle sarcasm, that nothing says progress like making destruction more efficient. You drift into the logic of blockade and starvation. Food becomes a weapon without ever firing a shot. One mainstream fact follows you into this quieter cruelty. Civilian deaths from hunger and deprivation rise sharply during industrial-era conflicts due to economic warfare. It's a kind of violence that feels clean on paper and devastating in kitchens. You imagine empty cupboards, long queues, and the slow grind of uncertainty. Another strange detail appears as you listen to planners talk. Some military theorists argue that breaking civilian morale will shorten wars and save lives overall. Historians still argue whether this logic ever truly works, but it's persuasive enough to justify bombing cities and targeting infrastructure. You notice how math enters morality, turning lives into variables. You walk beneath early aircraft, fragile-looking but full of promise and threat. Cities look different from above, smaller, abstract, easier to target. You feel how distance protects the conscience. Dropping something from the sky feels less personal than swinging a blade. The lesson echoes those colonial distances you felt earlier, now compressed into altitude. You pause inside a government office where maps cover walls. Lines move, numbers change. One mainstream fact grounds you again. During industrial wars, governments centralize control, directing economies and populations toward victory at almost any cost. You realize war crimes here don't always look like crimes. They look like policy decisions, justified in memos and speeches. A fringe tidbit slips in quietly. Some early military planners worry not about killing too many civilians, but about killing too few to matter strategically. Historians still argue how widespread this thinking is, but the fact that it exists at all feels heavy. You let that weight settle, then let your breathing slow again. You move through a city after a raid. Windows shattered, streets eerily calm. People step carefully, already adapting. This adaptability strikes you hardest. Humans are very good at surviving, even when survival means accepting the unacceptable. You remember ancient survivors sorted by usefulness and colonial subjects counted as labour. This is the same pattern, just louder. As wars drag on, you notice something else. Documentation improves. Cameras, reports, statistics, all of it records suffering in sharper detail. One mainstream fact follows you forward. Industrial-era conflicts generate unprecedented records of civilian harm. Paradoxically, more evidence doesn't always mean more restraint. Sometimes it just means better archives. You drift toward the end of this stretch where exhaustion sets in. Entire societies are tired. There's a longing for rules again, for limits that might actually hold. You sense something forming, an uneasy recognition that without boundaries, war will consume everything. It's not compassion alone driving this. It's fear of what comes next. You pause there, between smoke and silence, feeling the world inhale. The systems you've seen, empire, industry, distance, are converging. What follows will be more organized still, more chilling in its efficiency. You let the hum of machines fade into a low, steady sound, like a fan in a dark room. The lesson settles gently as you move on. When war becomes industrial, cruelty doesn't need passion or hatred. It only needs momentum. And once it has that, stopping it becomes the hardest task of all. You keep moving and the machines don't disappear. They quiet down, reorganize, and step indoors. The smoke thins, the noise dulls, and what replaces it is paperwork, schedules, and doors that close softly. You're entering a place where industrial efficiency no longer just supports violence, it becomes the violence. This is where evil stops shouting and starts filing forms. You walk into an office lit by weak daylight, desks aligned with uncomfortable precision. One mainstream historical fact settles in with chilling calm. During the Holocaust, Nazi Germany builds a system of persecution and mass murder that relies heavily on bureaucracy, rail networks, and administrative coordination. You notice immediately how ordinary the setting feels. No dramatic music, no raised voices, just men checking boxes and stamping papers. You follow a single document as it moves from desk to desk. Each signature advances something terrible without ever naming it. Euphemisms do the work. Resettlement, special treatment, processing. You feel how language becomes insulation, protecting those who use it from the reality it hides. A sleepy, uneasy aside drifts through your mind. This is what happens when spreadsheets grow a conscience-free spine. You step onto a train platform, quiet except for the scrape of boots and the hiss of steam. One widely accepted fact anchors you here. Railways play a central role in transporting victims to camps across occupied Europe. Trains run on time. Schedules are adjusted for efficiency. You realize how terrifying normality can be when it's harnessed to something monstrous. The system doesn't feel angry. It feels proud of its organization. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces. strange in its smallness. Some transport officials complain not about where trains are going, but about delays disrupting cargo priorities. Historians still argue how much these officials understood about the final outcomes, but standing here, partial ignorance doesn't feel like innocence. You feel how easy it is to focus on your slice of the task and never look at the whole. You move inside the camps without lingering on graphic detail. What matters here is structure. One mainstream fact settles heavily. Camps operate with hierarchies, quotas, and procedures designed to maximize control and minimize resistance. Violence is embedded in routine. You notice how even suffering has shifts, schedules, and rules. It's not chaos, it's management. You pause beside guards going through training. They're taught obedience, not reflection. You remember earlier soldiers hardened against pity and colonial officers rotated to avoid attachment. This is the same principle perfected. A modern aside flickers through your thoughts. HR onboarding, but for something unspeakable. The familiarity is part of what makes it so unsettling. Another odd detail drifts in, almost surreal. Some camp administrators obsess over record keeping, ensuring numbers add up precisely. Historians still argue whether this fixation reflects ideological commitment or bureaucratic habit, but you feel the result either way. Lives become entries, and entries feel easier to erase than faces. You step back and look at the wider picture. This isn't just about a few leaders or a single ideology. One mainstream fact grounds you again. The Holocaust involves cooperation across multiple institutions, government ministries, private companies, local authorities. You sense how responsibility diffuses outward until no one feels fully accountable. Everyone is just doing their job, a phrase that hums quietly like a lullaby you wish you couldn't hear. You notice moments of resistance flickering at the edges. People who refuse, who help, who sabotage quietly. They're fewer than you want, but they matter. Their existence proves that alternatives exist, even here. Historians still argue how widespread resistance could have been, and whether fear or conformity played the larger role. The uncertainty lingers, uncomfortable and unresolved. You drift into the aftermath, where the scale of what happened struggles to fit into language at all. One mainstream fact follows you into this silence. When the camps are liberated, even seasoned soldiers are shocked by what they find. Evidence is everywhere. Documents, bodies of proof, meticulous records. For once, denial has a harder time finding its footing. You move into courtrooms, quieter but tense. Trials begin. Words like crimes against humanity enter common use. You feel the weight of something new forming, an attempt to name evil that hides behind legality. It's imperfect and incomplete, but it's a start. You remember earlier ages where violence was celebrated or ignored, and sense a shift, however fragile. As you reach the edge of this section, the hum of bureaucracy fades, replaced by a low, unsettled silence. You realize this chapter isn't just about one crime, but about a method. The idea that mass harm can be organized so efficiently that it feels mundane. That's the shock that lingers longest. You take a slow breath, letting the room darken again. The lesson settles gently but firmly into you. When systems value obedience over conscience, cruelty doesn't need hatred to survive. It just needs everyone to keep their heads down and their pens moving. You don't get a pause. The silence after the camps dissolves into a different kind of noise. Cicadas, boots on dirt roads, distant aircraft engines humming over water. You're moving east now, across oceans and islands, into a war that unfolds far from many Western eyes, but leaves scars just as deep. The systems you've already felt, empire, industry, obedience, arrive here carrying new flags. You stand in occupied territory in Asia during the Second World War, where control is asserted quickly and brutally. One mainstream historical fact settles into place. The Japanese Empire commits widespread abuses against civilian populations and prisoners of war across East and Southeast Asia. What strikes you first is how occupation here feels raw, more intimate. Violence isn't always hidden behind paperwork. It often happens face to face. You walk through a city just after it's fallen. Authority changes overnight. Rules are announced in languages many don't understand. You feel the shock ripple through daily life. Curfews, forced bowing, sudden disappearances. A quiet, uneasy aside floats through your mind. This is what happens when conquest skips the hearts and minds phase entirely. You move into a prison camp where captured soldiers are held. One widely accepted fact anchors the moment. Allied prisoners of war in the Asia-Pacific theatre experience extremely high mortality rates compared to other fronts. Disease, starvation, and brutality become routine. You notice how neglect itself becomes a weapon. No dramatic orders are needed when food simply doesn't arrive. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces, unsettling in its specificity. Some camp guards are trained to view surrender as dishonourable, shaping how they treat prisoners who've laid down arms. Historians still argue how deeply this cultural belief drives abuse, versus how much is shaped by wartime chaos and shortages. But standing here, the belief feels heavy enough to matter. You drift into occupied countryside, where civilians are caught between armies. Villages are punished for suspected resistance, sometimes on the thinnest evidence. One mainstream fact follows you forward. Forced labour projects, including massive infrastructure builds, rely on civilian and prisoner labour under lethal conditions. You feel how scale replaces subtlety here. Progress is measured in miles completed, not lives lost. You pause along a jungle railway line, hearing hammers strike metal in humid air. You don't need details. The exhaustion is enough. You remember colonial labour systems from earlier, and see how war intensifies them. This isn't invention, it's acceleration. A soft, bitter joke drifts through your thoughts. Apparently, nothing motivates efficiency like absolute disregard. You notice how famine spreads alongside fighting. Fields are destroyed, supply lines collapse, and civilians bear the cost. One mainstream fact grounds you again. Wartime requisitioning and disruption contribute to severe food shortages across occupied regions. Hunger doesn't announce itself loudly. It just stays day after day until it reshapes everything. Another odd detail flickers into view. Some occupying forces issue detailed conduct codes that promise discipline and order, even as abuses continue. Historians still argue whether these codes reflect genuine intent or mere propaganda. But you feel the familiar dissonance. Rules written far from where they're broken. You move closer to the front lines now, where fighting is relentless and mercy feels impractical. You notice how dehumanization works quickly in such conditions. The enemy becomes a concept rather than a person. You think back to ancient slaughters and industrial bombing, and realize this is the same switch being flipped again, just in a different landscape. You pause near a group of civilians fleeing along a road carrying what they can. No one knows where safety is anymore. One mainstream fact follows you through this moment. Mass displacement becomes a defining feature of the Asia-Pacific War. You feel how uncertainty itself becomes a form of harm, stretching fear across months and years. A fringe tidbit drifts up, oddly human. Some soldiers keep small tokens from home, photos, charms, reminders of gentler lives. Historians still argue how individuals reconcile these private attachments with public cruelty, but you sense the contradiction living side by side, unresolved. As the war grinds on, atrocities begin to surface beyond the region. Survivors tell stories, evidence emerges. You feel the gap between experience and recognition narrowing, slowly. One mainstream fact anchors this transition. Post-war tribunals address crimes committed in the Asia-Pacific, though many victims feel justice is partial or absent. Naming harm doesn't erase it, but it does change the silence around it. You drift toward the end of this section as the fighting finally ebbs. Cities lie damaged, countryside altered, families broken in ways that statistics can't quite capture. You notice how memory here becomes contested, acknowledged in some places, minimized or denied in others. That tension hums quietly, unresolved. You take a slow breath as the jungle sounds soften into night insects. The lesson settles gently again. When war crosses cultures and continents, cruelty adapts to local beliefs and pressures, but its core remains the same. Systems excuse it, distance hides it, and ordinary people once more are left to live with what history eventually labels a crime. You don't feel a clean ending as the war fades. Instead, it cools into something tense and watchful. The world exhales, then holds its breath. You step into a time where peace is declared loudly, but violence keeps happening quietly, usually somewhere far away. This is the age of proxy wars, where superpowers avoid fighting each other directly and instead test their strength on other people's homes. You find yourself in a small country that barely registers on global maps, yet suddenly matters a great deal. One mainstream historical fact settles in smoothly. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union support opposing sides in conflicts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. You notice how language does a lot of work here. Words like containment, liberation, and security float around, abstract enough to feel harmless, heavy enough to justify almost anything. You walk through a village where uniforms change every few years, sometimes faster. Each new group arrives with promises, lists, and suspicions. Civilians learn to say very little. You catch a tired, modern aside in your thoughts. Nothing says stability like being important to someone else's ideology. The violence here isn't always explosive, it's persistent, like a low fever that never quite breaks. You step into a detention center, run by a regime backed by outside funding. One mainstream fact anchors this moment. Many Cold War-era governments commit widespread human rights abuses, including torture and extrajudicial killings, often with foreign support. You notice how these acts are framed as intelligence gathering or counterinsurgency. The goal isn't justice, it's control. Fear becomes infrastructure. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces, chilling in its mundanity. Some training manuals used by proxy forces include psychological techniques designed to break detainees without leaving obvious marks. Historians still argue how standardized these methods are, and who bears ultimate responsibility for spreading them. But you feel the familiar pattern. Distance blurs accountability. You drift into the countryside, where war looks different again. Guerrilla fighters move through forests and mountains. Villages are accused of helping one side or the other, sometimes both, sometimes neither. One mainstream fact follows you here. Civilian populations suffer heavily in insurgency wars due to reprisals, forced relocations, and scorched earth tactics. You feel how suspicion itself becomes dangerous. Being neutral isn't an option when everyone is watching. You remember earlier empires relocating communities and colonial powers enforcing quotas. This feels like an echo. A soft, weary joke passes through your mind. History really does love reruns, just with updated uniforms. The tactics aren't new, they're recycled, refined, and justified with fresher slogans. You pause beside a military advisor far from home, clipboard in hand. He doesn't pull triggers, he evaluates performance. One mainstream fact grounds you again. Foreign advisors play key roles in training and shaping proxy forces while maintaining plausible deniability. You notice how this setup allows responsibility to be endlessly deferred. Orders come from somewhere else. Blame goes nowhere. Another odd detail floats in. Some conflicts are barely reported internationally unless something dramatic happens. Historians still argue how media attention shapes which atrocities enter global memory, and which fade locally, but you can feel the imbalance. Silence isn't neutral, it's selective. You move into a city where ideology paints walls and fills radio broadcasts. People repeat slogans carefully. One mainstream fact follows you into this space. Propaganda becomes a central tool in Cold War conflicts, framing violence as necessary defense against an existential threat. When survival feels absolute, limits feel negotiable. You think back to sacred violence and industrial justifications and realize this is the same switch again. Fear replacing faith, ideology replacing empire. You notice how children grow up quickly here. Checkpoints become landmarks. Sirens become background noise. A fringe tidbit drifts in quietly. In some regions, children can identify different weapons by sound before they learn formal geography. Historians still argue how growing up in conflict reshapes identity long-term, but standing here, the answer feels obvious. You drift toward the aftermath of one such conflict. Officially, peace arrives. Unofficially, wounds remain open. Mass graves are whispered about. Files stay sealed. One mainstream fact anchors this uneasy quiet. Many Cold War-era atrocities are investigated decades later, if at all. Time becomes a shield, wearing down outrage into something easier to manage. You sit with survivors who don't expect justice anymore, just acknowledgement. They speak softly, not because the story is weak, but because they've learned volume doesn't guarantee being heard. You remember earlier sections where documentation increased but restraint didn't, and you feel the same frustration here. Knowing doesn't always stop harm. Sometimes it just records it. As you move toward the edge of this section, the global tension begins to ease. Walls fall, flags change, the Cold War ends on paper. You sense relief, but it's incomplete. The habits formed during these decades don't vanish overnight. They linger in institutions, tactics, and unmarked graves. You take a slow breath as the ideological noise fades. The lesson settles in with a tired familiarity. When powerful rivals fight indirectly, the violence doesn't disappear, it relocates. It concentrates in places where accountability is thin and memory is fragile. And the people who live there are left carrying the weight of a war that was never really theirs to begin with. You step back onto European soil, but it doesn't feel familiar. The shadows of old wars stretch long, and neighbours who once greeted each other over fences now eye each other with suspicion. You're moving into an era where ethnicity, nationality, and ideology collide in ways that make ordinary citizens suddenly enemies. This is where ethnic cleansing takes root, quietly at first, then with alarming speed. You walk through a small town where signs of everyday life, bread ovens, market stalls, children chasing bulls, sit side by side with barricades and patrols. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. In the Balkans during the 1990s, ethnic cleansing campaigns forcibly displaced thousands, sometimes leaving entire villages empty. You feel how fear becomes ambient, spreading faster than news, reshaping social bonds before bullets do. You notice how neighbours talk in hushed tones, cautious of who might be listening. Old friendships are tested, fractured, or broken entirely. A sleepy, modern aside drifts into your mind. Nothing erodes community faster than suspicion married to authority. This isn't chaos, it's social engineering through fear. You catch yourself thinking, with a quiet, bitter irony, that civility can be weaponized as easily as a rifle. You drift into makeshift shelters where displaced families huddle together. One widely accepted fact follows you here. Internally displaced persons often lack food, water, and medical care, making survival itself a challenge. You realize that while overt violence may be less visible than massacres, deprivation and forced migration operate with the same cruel efficiency. Hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty become weapons without ever needing a formal order. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces, almost absurd in its small detail. In some areas, entire communities are required to mark their homes with symbols or flags, identifying ethnic identity, effectively turning civilians into walking maps for aggressors. Historians still argue how widespread or enforced such practices were, but their existence is chilling enough. The lesson is clear. Bureaucracy and symbolism can be as deadly as direct violence. You walk through checkpoints where soldiers scrutinize identity papers and origins. One mainstream fact grounds you again. Such identity verification systems are central to modern campaigns of ethnic cleansing, often facilitated by technology and state records. You feel how ordinary administrative tools, lists, stamps, databases, can morph into instruments of oppression. It's eerily familiar after everything you've seen so far. You pause near a burned-out village, where walls are scorched and doors hang off hinges. Another odd detail drifts in. Sometimes perpetrators deliberately leave symbols or graffiti to mark territory, communicate intent, or terrorize survivors. Historians still argue the strategic versus psychological purpose of these signs, but standing here, they feel like warnings etched into memory. You notice the psychological weight on children. Some can recount every village they were forced through. Some memorize the faces of strangers who decided who lived and who was expelled. One mainstream fact follows you. Long-term trauma from ethnic cleansing affects generations, shaping identity, mental health, and social cohesion decades later. You feel the resonance of this pattern stretching beyond immediate violence. You drift into urban centers where propaganda amplifies fear. Radio, posters, and local officials frame certain groups as threats. A fringe tidbit surfaces quietly. In some cases, local myths and rumours are deliberately spread to stoke panic and justify expulsions. Historians still debate the degree of intentional manipulation versus spontaneous hysteria, but either way, the effect is devastating. You walk through refugee camps where international observers try to intervene. You notice how complicated aid becomes. Logistics, politics, mistrust and danger all tangled together. One mainstream fact anchors this moment. International organisations often arrive too late to prevent displacement, highlighting the gap between recognition and action. Delay itself becomes a silent accomplice to harm. You pause beside survivors recounting stories, some whispered, some recorded for posterity. Memory becomes both shield and burden. You think back to industrial wars, colonial occupations, and Cold War proxy conflicts. This is the same pattern of suffering repeated, adjusted to new settings, justified in different languages, but familiar in its mechanics. You notice how even as ethnic cleansing ends, fractures remain. Communities are permanently altered. Some never return. One mainstream fact settles quietly. Post-conflict reconciliation often takes decades, and even then scars remain etched into land, laws, and memory. You sense how history, again, doesn't forget. It stores silently and waits. As the section edges to a close, night falls across these displaced towns and empty villages. You feel the weight of human cruelty interwoven with human survival. Ordinary people, under pressure, bend, break, or flee, and in doing so, shape the lessons of modern warfare. The echoes of distrust, fear, and resilience stretch forward, preparing you for the next chapter of global suffering and remembrance. You step into a quieter, colder part of the world now, where violence is no longer about armies marching or bombs falling, but about borders drawn on maps and populations controlled with invisible pressure. It's the modern era, where technology amplifies the ability to harm and distance shields the conscience. You feel the chill of precision, surveillance, and the bureaucratic ease of cruelty. You walk through a city monitored by cameras, drones hovering silently above, authorities tracking movements down to individual blocks. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. In contemporary conflicts, modern surveillance and data collection allow governments and military actors to identify, isolate, and target populations more efficiently than ever before. You notice how the world feels smaller but more controlled, as if fear itself has been compressed and stored in circuitry. You drift through neighborhoods where messaging is constant. Radio, television, social media, all instruments shaping perception, often twisting it to justify actions taken in the name of security or ideology. A sleepier side drifts through your mind. Information, once a weapon only in print or rumor, now flies instantly, leaving little time for reflection or empathy. You sense how mass communication has become part of the machinery of war crimes. You pass a checkpoint where armed officers interrogate civilians. One widely accepted fact follows you here. Targeted harassment, intimidation, and detention of minority groups are common tactics in modern authoritarian conflicts. It's chilling how normalized these measures feel to the people implementing them. They often see themselves as enforcing law rather than committing crimes. You remember earlier bureaucracies, from colonial administrators to Nazi officials, and note the disturbing continuity. A quirky historical tidbit surfaces. In some regions, authorities use GPS-enabled devices to track livestock or crops, ostensibly for economic reasons, while simultaneously monitoring human movement. Historians still debate how deliberate or incidental the harm is, but standing here, the overlap between mundane management and coercion feels unmistakable. You wander into refugee settlements where displaced families cling to whatever stability they can find. One mainstream fact grounds you again. In modern conflicts, civilians often face compounded risks: violence, deprivation, disease, and displacement, simultaneously creating multi-layered suffering that persists long after the fighting ends. You feel the exhaustion of adaptation and survival that echoes centuries of repeated patterns. You pause near an aid distribution point where lines are long and tension is high. Another odd detail drifts in. Sometimes local authorities manipulate aid access as a form of control, rewarding compliance and punishing perceived dissent. Historians still argue whether such practices are widespread or opportunistic, but the effect is consistent. Power enforces itself through scarcity, not just force. You drift through urban centres where protests flare and crackdowns follow swiftly. Modern weaponry and legal frameworks combine to make repression efficient, less visible, but no less devastating. One mainstream fact follows you. Extrajudicial detentions, disappearances, and targeted assassinations continue to occur in many conflict zones globally, showing that international norms, while stronger than before, cannot fully prevent abuse. You notice the psychological landscape. Fear is constant, yet often invisible, shaping choices, speech, and movement. Children and youth grow up in this climate, learning survival strategies early. A fringe tidbit drifts in quietly. Some local communities develop coded languages, gestures, and rituals to avoid detection, a human ingenuity born from necessity. Historians still debate how much such adaptations mitigate harm versus just prolong exposure, but their existence signals resilience. You move toward infrastructure, roads, bridges, communication lines, being targeted strategically. One mainstream fact settles in. Modern warfare often focuses on disrupting civilian life indirectly, such as through electricity, water, and transport, rather than direct confrontation. The result is the same. People are harmed, even if no shots are fired at them personally. You notice the subtle evolution from old tactics of punishment and displacement to modern, calculated disruption. You pause near a quiet neighborhood, watching life attempt to resume amidst uncertainty. The weight of history presses in. Industrial wars, ethnic cleansing, colonial terror, all echo here in structure if not in context. Ordinary people still bear the brunt, systems still shield perpetrators, and accountability still struggles to catch up. You feel the lesson again. Cruelty adapts to technology, but the human consequences remain stubbornly familiar. You drift into reflection as night falls, city lights flickering like distant stars. Surveillance hums faintly in the background. You feel the tension between visibility and invisibility, control and chaos, and how modernity has made evil efficient, silent, and systematic. Yet even here, resilience persists, faint but unyielding. As you reach the end of this stretch, you sense the current of history converging. Systems, technologies, ideologies, all intersecting to magnify both suffering and survival. You take a slow, deep breath, letting the lesson settle. In the modern world, war crimes are rarely isolated. They are networks, flowing through institutions, borders, and lives, leaving marks that linger long after headlines fade. You step into a quieter, digital age, but don't mistake quiet for safety. Violence has become networked, precise, and often invisible. You're moving into a world where war crimes can unfold in milliseconds, crossing borders with a click, and where the boundaries between military, cyber, and civilian spaces blur. The battlefield has expanded to include homes, hospitals, and even entire digital networks. You drift through a city whose skyline is punctuated by antennas and satellites. One mainstream historical fact anchors you here. The 21st century introduces cyber warfare and drone strikes that can harm civilian populations remotely, creating new forms of accountability challenges. You notice the odd dichotomy. Precision weapons promise minimal collateral damage, yet errors and miscalculations leave human lives devastated. You sense a quiet irony. Technology is supposed to reduce suffering, but it often redistributes it. You pause near a refugee center that has been targeted by misinformation campaigns. Civilians huddle in uncertainty, unsure which sources to trust. A sleepy aside drifts through your mind. Propaganda used to be posters and broadcasts. Now it's memes, viral videos, and fabricated messages that spread faster than anyone can verify. You feel the psychological weight as tangibly as physical hunger. One widely accepted fact surfaces. Modern conflicts increasingly involve targeted assassinations, drone strikes, and cyber attacks that inadvertently, or sometimes deliberately, harm civilians. You notice how this mirrors the industrialization of violence you saw centuries ago. Scale, speed, and technology amplify suffering, even when the intention isn't overtly malicious. The pattern repeats, only the tools have changed. A quirky historical tidbit drifts in, almost mundane. In some conflicts, social media algorithms inadvertently amplify messages of hate or encourage the targeting of specific groups. Historians still argue how much of this is manipulation versus unintended consequence, but the outcome, vulnerability made visible, is unmistakable. You walk through a border region where civilians are trapped between factions, each wielding digital and physical force. One mainstream fact grounds you: displaced populations now face not only physical threats, but also digital surveillance that can inform targeting, restrict aid, or manipulate movement. Technology adds a new layer to an old problem: control without presence. You notice the psychological landscape shifting subtly. People learn to hide online as they hide in alleys, to distrust messages as much as footsteps. A fringe tidbit surfaces. In some areas, entire communities develop offline methods to preserve privacy, from analog communication networks to coded signals. Historians still debate the scale and effectiveness of these practices, but their existence speaks to human adaptability. You pause near a ruined hospital, an unspoken testament to the intersection of modern warfare and civilian vulnerability. One mainstream fact follows you: targeting infrastructure in recent conflicts continues to devastate essential services, leaving populations exposed to starvation, disease, and insecurity. The same logic you've seen before, control through deprivation, remains unchanged. You drift into the realm of global accountability. International courts, tribunals, and watchdog organizations attempt to document, prosecute, and prevent these crimes. Yet even here, the scale of digital and remote warfare presents unprecedented challenges. You remember tribunals after World War II and Cold War investigations: imperfect, delayed, incomplete, and see history repeating in a more technologically complex arena. As night falls over this digital battlefield, the lessons crystallize. Precision and speed have changed, but the mechanics of harm remain. Power seeks efficiency, civilians bear the cost, and technology amplifies both cruelty and survival strategies. You take a deep breath and let the lesson settle. War crimes have evolved, but their human impact remains stubbornly familiar. You drift toward the edge of this era, sensing the convergence of all patterns you've witnessed: industrial, bureaucratic, ideological, and technological violence. They all interweave into a tapestry that is sobering, humbling, and endlessly instructive about human behavior under power, fear, and indifference. You step into the present, where the world seems connected by light-speed communication, yet the echoes of past atrocities ripple endlessly beneath the surface. Modern conflicts, humanitarian crises, and systemic abuses remind you that cruelty has no expiration date. It adapts, mutates, and often hides behind legality, ideology, or convenience. You sense the patterns clearly now. Distance, bureaucracy, ideology, and technology all converge, amplifying the same fundamental human vulnerabilities you've traced across centuries. You walk through a contemporary urban centre, watching civilians navigate checkpoints, surveillance cameras, and subtle pressures that dictate movement and behaviour. One mainstream historical fact anchors this moment. Today, civilians in war-torn regions continue to suffer from mass displacement, targeted violence, and systematic repression, even in contexts where international law technically prohibits such actions. You notice how these atrocities are often obscured by political language, euphemisms, and fragmented media coverage. A sleepy aside drifts through your mind. History has a frustrating habit of repeating itself in ways that are both obvious and invisible. You pause at a humanitarian aid station. Supplies arrive, but not fast enough. You see families rationing food, makeshift shelters, and children learning caution earlier than any curriculum would dictate. One widely accepted fact follows you here. Access to essential resources during modern conflicts is a tool of control, sometimes weaponized deliberately to force compliance or punish dissent. You feel the subtle continuity. From empires' forced relocations to industrialized warfare, from ethnic cleansing to cyber-enabled deprivation, the mechanics of suffering remain familiar, though the tools evolve. A quirky historical tidbit drifts in, almost absurd in its modernity. Some relief workers use drones to deliver supplies in high-risk zones. Yet the same technology can be repurposed for surveillance or targeted attacks. Historians still debate whether technological innovation ultimately reduces suffering or simply shifts the locus of harm. But standing here, you feel the tension in every delivery, every flight, every unseen camera lens. You move through stories of survivors and witnesses. Their accounts are mosaic-like, personal, collective, harrowing, and resolute. Another mainstream fact grounds you. Documentation and reporting of contemporary war crimes are far more comprehensive than in the past, yet enforcement remains inconsistent, leaving gaps where justice struggles to reach. You notice how awareness alone rarely suffices to prevent future violations. You drift along borders and conflict zones, noticing patterns of forced migration, clandestine detention, and propaganda campaigns. Another odd detail surfaces. Social media amplifies misinformation, sometimes guiding violence indirectly. Historians still argue how much online influence shapes real-world atrocities, but the link between communication, perception, and harm is undeniable. It's the digital evolution of a centuries-old problem. You pause near refugee camps glowing under artificial lights, imagining how the children growing up here will carry lessons learned under fear and displacement. One fringe tidbit drifts in quietly. Some local communities develop covert educational practices to preserve knowledge and identity, even under surveillance or occupation. Historians still debate their effectiveness, but their persistence speaks to human resilience. You watch humanitarian workers, journalists, and aid agencies navigate the complex moral and logistical landscape. They are the inheritors of lessons from industrialized war, bureaucratic crimes, and Cold War proxy conflicts. Yet you notice a subtle truth. No matter how sophisticated the systems, human suffering remains stubbornly difficult to contain. Ordinary people continue to pay the price, while structures of accountability often lag behind. Finally, as night settles, you step back to see the whole arc of history. The empires, the industrialized conflicts, the genocides, the proxy wars, and the modern, high-tech atrocities, all interconnected by recurring patterns of power, fear, and vulnerability. You feel how essential it is to remember, to document, and to bear witness. History does not forgive negligence, nor does it excuse repetition. But awareness is a fragile armor, a way to recognize patterns and perhaps prevent them from continuing. You take one last, deep breath. The lesson is clear. Cruelty adapts, but human resilience endures alongside it. You let the quiet settle, the lights dim in your mind, and the echoes of history slowly fade, preparing you for the slow, comforting descent into reflection and sleep. The night stretches around you, soft and deep, like a blanket pulled over a restless world. You feel the pulse of history slow, the echoes of centuries of cruelty growing fainter, as if they too are listening for a pause. Firelight flickers in the corner of your mind, casting dancing shadows on memories of distant empires, industrial battlefields, occupied villages, and modern cities where survival is a daily negotiation. Each glow is a heartbeat, each ember a quiet witness to the resilience that endures even in the face of repeated harm. You let yourself drift alongside these images, the heat from the fire wrapping around your awareness like warmth around a chilled body. Streets once torn by conflict are empty now, and the air carries only the soft hum of evening, the distant murmur of water, or the subtle creak of trees swaying in a gentle breeze. Life continues in these quiet corners, stubborn, patient, and determined to rebuild. You notice how small acts, lighting a candle, whispering a story, offering a meal, become monumental in their persistence, tiny rebellions against the weight of history. The glow spreads, softening hard edges of memory, smoothing harsh lines into gentle arcs. You feel the world exhale, letting you sink into a slower rhythm, the cadence of breathing, of hearts, of time itself. Shadows fade into deep velvet night, and the sharpness of past horrors blurs into understanding, recognition, and quiet vigilance. As your thoughts settle, the embers dim and the room around you feels still. You are left with warmth, faint light, and the soft assurance that survival and empathy endure alongside cruelty. Let your mind float with the glowing firelight. Imagine stories whispered across time and allow your consciousness to drift softly, weightless, towards sleep. Good night.